Good morning. Robert Leahy is a psychologist who works in the field of mental health for many, many years in the United States. And he said that sometimes people who, when they're unemployed, they get locked into a sense of themselves as somehow being different people. And as he said, the important thing is you've got to recognize that you're not any different to anybody else out there, regardless of what anyone might say to you. You're just in a temporary situation with which you must learn to cope. So that essentially is what I want to look at today. I'm going to be looking at your thinking style particularly. That's why the title of this talk is It's the Thought That Counts. And if you're not convinced of that right now, I hope by the end of this morning you will be. But I want to take you on a few areas I want to cover. First of all, I'm going to look at the impact and the effects of unemployment. What happens to people when they become unemployed, particularly from a psychological perspective. Secondly, we're going to look at your thinking style. And if you've had any idea of this before or not, maybe it will give you some new ideas about that. How do you park negatives? When you're in a negative, difficult situation, and that is your reality, what do you do to do that? And in that context, I want to look at how do you deal with self-criticism. And you may be a self-critical individual, you may not be. There are some good and bad points about that. And how do you learn not to be a victim? Because that's really critical as well in all of this as well. And also, how do you engage positively with this program? And then finally, I'm going to look at your intentionality. How do you commit to moving forward? So as I've said before at this, if I was to do this and give it its full attention that it probably deserves, I would probably do it as a workshop over 2 days. You're getting an hour, so a lot of it's going to be squeezed in. But I will try and take questions towards the end as well and leave a little bit of time for that. So if you've got questions as we're going along and they're not answered, then please just make a note of them as well. I'll also be making this available to Niamh as well and to the job care people. So if you want to look at the slides or whatever, please go to Niamh. Niamh can send them on to you if you want to have a look at them. But I want to start by taking you on a bit of a journey. And we're going to spend a little bit of time in Turkey, in Istanbul. We're going to talk a little bit about the Swimming Olympics and some of the things that have happened in there as well from a psychological perspective. And I want to introduce you to a gentleman called Professor Martin Seligman. Martin Seligman is a very well-known psychologist in the United States of America, president of the American Psychological Society. And he coined a term called explanatory style. And what this does is this accounts for the way that different people react to the same event. So when certain events occur, why is it that some people will think one way about it and others will have a completely different perspective on it? So we'll be spending a little bit of time in there as well and talking about his experience. But first of all, I said I would take you to Turkey, but actually I'm taking you to a football match. Now, even if you don't like football, bear with me please. This is the Ataturk Stadium in Istanbul. And I want to take you to a football match between AC Milan and Liverpool in 2005. Any of you who are good football fans or particularly Liverpool supporters will know what this is all about. It was the European Champions League final. And the half-time score was AC Milan 3, Liverpool 0. Now, what you've got to bear in mind is that AC Milan had won the trophy, I think, 3 times in the previous 7 years. Liverpool, it was their first time back, as far as I recall, in this competition, but certainly their first time to reach the final in many years since the Heysel Stadium disaster many years before this. Now, critically, AC Milan had scored goals in the first minute and in the 44th minute. Now, if you really want to get a team and you want to stick it to them, get a goal in the first couple of minutes and get another one in just before half-time. And not only that, but they had another one in for good measure. Now, what happened next is important. Thousands of Liverpool fans left the stadium to go off and drown their sorrows. Any idea why you think they might have done that? Lost hope? So, no belief in their team? Yeah, those kinds of things. So they all went off to the nearest pubs just to go and drown their sorrows, as it were. Now, second half, between the 54th and 60th minute, Liverpool happened to score 3 goals. Absolutely stunning. Now, The story is that while these guys were watching the match in the pub and the first goal went in, some of them had a little bit of hope and they got up and left. When the second goal went in, more of them got up and left to go back to the stadium. And by the time the third goal went in, everybody had gotten up, tried to get back into the stadium. Now, in fact, there was a problem when they reached the stadium because the Turkish police wouldn't let them in, and there was almost a riot outside while this huge argument went on. Because as far as the Turkish police were concerned, you've left the stadium, you're not getting back in. And in fact, the full-time score was 3-3, and Liverpool won the penalty shootout 3-2. So that's the thing to think about. What is it that makes some people in a particular set of circumstances decide, I'm sticking in here, I'm staying with this, and others to decide, I'm going in another direction? So we'll come back to that, and hopefully you get to understand why that might be in a few minutes. What is the impact that unemployment has on people? What does the research say? I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what we know about the impact. First of all, we know that there is a significant relationship between being unemployed and having psychological stress. So yes, once you're unemployed, and the longer you are unemployed for, the chances are you're going to have an increased level of stress as well. We know that most commonly we see people with anxiety, with depression and substance abuse. We know that suicide and violence towards family members and others also are increased with unemployment. Now that's all, not to say that all of you are, dangerous people or anything like that. We just know it goes up. And what is interesting is that this happens even in people who don't have any prior history of psychological difficulties. So we know it can be a specific aspect of unemployment. Now, I know I'm giving you all the bad news so far, but hang in there. What about marriage? Now, what's interesting there in marriage is that, in fact, there is no direct relationship between unemployment and marital dissatisfaction. If you have been unhappily married before, then you will remain unhappily married when you're unemployed. But if you are happily married, already, the chances are, if your marriage is good, even in unemployment, what's interesting is that stable relationship very often holds. So that is just an encouraging thing for those of you who may be in a long-term relationship. And there's also a group of people I want you to consider called the underemployed, because some of you may already be or have found yourself to be in a situation like this. And we're talking about the kind of people who in certain circumstances find themselves in positions below their capacity or their training level. So they're not actually included under the employed, but we know that the stress factors are exactly the same. So they've got inadequate financial compensation, there's lack of benefits, there's loss of prestige because of the kind of job that they're doing. So an example of that might be a college graduate who takes an unpaid internship, doing a very good job but not getting paid, or maybe just getting paid a very small amount of money, or someone who's waiting tables at night but yet is qualified to do much, much more. And the kind of distress that they experience is pretty much indistinguishable from those who experience unemployment. So what's the cure? Well, the obvious answer is get a job, get some work, and we wouldn't be sitting here and you wouldn't be having to deal with it. But in the absence of that being the obvious answer, here's a couple of things I want you to consider. I want you to think about the fact that unemployment and the impact of it is actually a little bit like a grief reaction. And most people who go through unemployment or when they become unemployed experience grief. Now, what do I mean by that? What are the stages of grief? Well, first of all, there's the disbelief. When you're first told or when it first dawns on you that you're going to be unemployed. And it's like most people, when they hear news they don't want to hear, the answer or the response they get is, I don't believe it. You cannot be serious. This cannot be happening to me. So you want to block out that reality. The second stage that people often go through is bargaining. They might bargain with their employer. Why does it have to be me? Could it not be somebody else? What if I did the job for less? What if I took this on instead? So they begin to do that kind of bargaining. Sometimes then they do that bargaining within their own head as well. So they do begin to wonder, and particularly when they have to face the reality of unemployment, What they go through is this idea that, oh, if only I'd done that differently, if I delivered on that project on time, whatever it might be. So they get into this kind of bargaining phase and they play out this movie in their head over and over and over again. The next stage is anger. The anger may be toward the former employer, it may be toward yourself, it may be to do with people around you, it may be to do with God, but you start getting angry. And usually then follows a period of depression. Because the circumstances you're recognizing are real, there's not a lot you might feel you can do about it, so you fall into a kind of a sadness, not sleeping at night, concerned about the future, a lot of things looking negative. And only finally then does acceptance begin to hit. Now what I want to emphasize about this, because this is the same with anyone who goes through a grief reaction, is that this is not a linear progression. You don't go through this for so many days or so many weeks or so many months and go up and then on to the next stage. This can happen 5 times in an hour. It can happen 5 times in a day. So you can find yourself moving up and down the scale here several times in a day, in a week, in a month. And that's okay. What's important is that you begin to recognize where any of these symptoms are hitting you. It is normal. It's okay. And what's important is give yourself a little bit of space to experience it rather than running away from it. So I said I would talk to you about this guy, Martin Seligman, who coined this phrase, attributional style. Martin is well known for his research on depression and particularly looking at what, in a term we call learned helplessness. How is it that some people find themselves in a situation whereby they simply learn to become helpless? And the reality is that we know some people give up easily because they've learned earlier on in life that when things go wrong, the idea they get locked into is there's nothing that they can do to fix this or change it. So then they give up very easily and they often fall into a depressive state. But the reality is we know that not everybody gives up given the same stimulus. And the reason why is something that we call explanatory style. And this is the way you usually explain an event to yourself. So when something goes wrong in your life, what do you start to tell yourself? What is it that you're tuning into? Now, what I want you to bear in mind here as well is that while we're talking about this, we have something in the region of 40 to 80,000 thoughts per day. That's the average. Okay? Now, capturing which ones are doing the damage can be a little bit difficult, but this is what the average human being goes through, and you have the capacity to think at a rate of 13 thoughts per second. That's why we're far better than any computer. It's why we have such quick reactions. So bear that in mind as we're working through the rest of this. What's interesting about this whole area is that when Martin Seligman began to publish a lot of his papers on this, the US military took a great deal of interest in him and in his work. And unintentionally, he found himself in giving lectures to groups of American military personnel talking all about this attributional or explanatory style. And they went away and began to use this in places like Guantanamo Bay. And in fact, his name then became associated with this, though he'd no idea that this is what they had in mind when they called him along. And he got a bit of bad press for it in the United States, again, without having intended to. So, one of the interesting things about Seligman was there was, he was, just to give you an idea of this idea of attributional style, he was having lunch one day with a senior recruiter belonged to the Metropolitan Insurance Company in America, in New York. And the guy was bemoaning the fact that once again they were on a big round of recruitment. And what this had to do was mainly to do with their salespeople, with the guys selling insurance. And Seligman said, well, what's the problem? He said, look, he said, we have a fallout rate in year one of 90%. In other words, if we take on 100 people, 90 of them are going to be gone by the end of the year, because selling insurance is a tough business and most of them don't last. So Martin Seligman, given this kind of research, got very interested in this. And he asked him, he said, do you think you could run something by your board? He said, would you ask them if I could take on some of your people, maybe 10% of the group that you're taking on. So say you're taking on 1,000, can I take on 100? But can I take them on according to my criteria, but as long as they have the educational ability that you require? So the guy went away to the board and they said, hey, nothing to lose, let's give it a shot and see what happens. And at the end of the year, Seligman went back to them and said, just wondering, how did my guys get on, the 10% of people that you took on? And they said, well, you know, Marty, it's really interesting because whilst 90% of the usual group we took on left, 90% of your guys stayed. And they were all over him like a rash. They wanted to know, what was it? What went on? And what he found, what he said to them was very simple. It was to do with their attributional style. And all I did during my interview with them was, I found out what did they do, what did they say when things went wrong in their lives. So I asked them about all the bad things that happened in their lives and to what they attributed that. And I took on the guys who didn't blame themselves. And he said, the reason I did that was because I figured in selling insurance, you're getting constant rejection. Most people are not going to be interested and they're going to turn you away. So he said, I figured those guys need the kind of style where they're going to say to themselves, oh, it's obviously a bad day for that lady, or this isn't a good time to call. So in other words, they weren't turning it in on themselves. So we're going to talk a little bit about that whole area. So first of all, you've got to bear in mind that what I'm talking about here is a personality variable. And when things go well, as I said, to what or to whom do you attribute success or failure? If you have an optimistic style, the chances are it will actually increase success in your life. In fact, we can go further. We know that people who have a more optimistic, explanatory style in their lives also are healthier, less likely to get depressed as well. And pessimists, when they experience things going wrong, or even when they experience things going right, they tend to see success as a fluke. In other words, it was just chance that it happened. And any adversity that comes their way, oh, this is a huge obstacle, I can't overcome it, and they're more likely to give up earlier, and in fact, they're less likely to succeed. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like, if you look here at a bad event, this is in blue, the optimist will say to themselves that a bad event is a temporary thing, that it's isolated, it's a kind of a one-off thing, and you know, it's one of those things that's got nothing to do with me, it's out of my control. The pessimist, on the other hand, when a bad event happens, will say, oh, this is typical, this is the kind of thing that keeps on happening to me. So it's fairly permanent, it's far-reaching, and somehow it's due to their own effort, that somehow they have had a part to play in the event going wrong. I'll give you an example. One lady who attended me one time told me that at a particular time she decided she would get more politically involved with a particular political party here in Dublin. And she went off and offered her services to help out with a TD in her locality who was getting re-elected. Now, this guy had been elected every year, every time there was an election, for the past 5 elections. So he was seen as a kind of a shoe-in for the next election. Anyway, he lost. And he lost a seat. First time, I think, in 15, 16 years or something like that. She said it was because I was on his team. Okay, now all she was doing was going around door to door and handing out the leaflets and saying, please vote for Joe Bloggs. But somehow she said, no, I brought the bad luck on him. So very much caught up in this pessimistic style. Now, on the other side here, if we look at good events, what happens? The optimists tend to see good events as being permanent, as being far-reaching, and due to their own effort. And the pessimists tend to go in the other direction. So that, as I said, even when good things happen, they're not able to hold on to them historically as something that they can do something about. So what about the impact? Just to look at some of the studies in this area. First of all, I said with health, we know that people who have a positive explanatory style, they have better health, they live longer as well than people who have a pessimistic style. In insurance sales, they found that optimistic sales agents outsell pessimists by 38%. And if you're extremely optimistic, that you will actually outsell an extreme pessimist by 88%. In the motor industry, we know optimistic sales agents outsell the pessimists by about 20%. And in telecommunications, telesales people, they outsell pessimists by about 29%, and again by 39% if you're extremely optimistic. So in order to just try and understand that, there are three parameters I want you to get hold of. First of all, it's what we call internality. So when something goes wrong, is it my fault or yours? Now, I've an idea there's probably a question floating around here as well, so hopefully I will answer that in a few minutes around what about, not taking responsibility and all that, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Stability. Is this one-off event, unlikely, or is this something that I see as a regular, permanent occurrence? It always happens to me. Now, think about things like if you're waiting for a bus, do you tend to kind of say things yourself like, when I go for a bus, I always find I'm waiting 20 minutes, half an hour, and then three of them come together. Or if I go to get on a queue in the bank or wherever it is, I always happen to get onto the wrong queue. Just watch out for that kind of thinking style on an ongoing basis. And how global is that? Do you feel, is this just isolated when something goes wrong? Is it isolated to one area of your life? Or do you feel this is typical, it just looks at so many other areas as well? Now, I said I'd bring you to the swimming Olympics. And this is a lady, some of you who are old enough might remember. And I'm bringing you back to 1996, the Atlanta Olympics. There's a lady called Michelle Smith. Now, Michelle Smith won 3 gold medals and a bronze medal at these Olympics. But actually, just for the moment, I'm going to park Michelle Smith and put her to one side because she's not quite who I'm interested in just yet. I'm interested in the person who came second in one of those races. And I want to introduce you to this lady, Alison Wagner. She got the silver medal for the 400 meters individual medley. This is her receiving her silver medal. Okay? Now, Alison Wagner was one of the best swimmers of her generation. In fact, one of the records that she set at 17 years of age was only beaten about 7 or 8 years ago. She was that good. And she was pounding through so many different situations. I think at this time, she was only 18 or 19, in fact, during these Olympics. So she should have had a huge career ahead of her. She won 2 silver medals in the Atlanta Olympics, silver. Alison Wagner never swam competitively again. Within a year of these Olympics, and this is on public record, she ended up in a psychiatric hospital with depression, anorexia, and low self-esteem. They were the conditions they were treating her for. And what she says about herself at that time is this. She said, I was living in a warped situation in that if I didn't win 2 gold medals in world record times, I was an absolute and complete failure. So just think here about the explanatory style. I blame myself for not performing. I buckled under the pressure, but that wasn't the case. She said, I just had no energy. But my whole life, my whole self-worth rested on those swims. Now that to me was a tragic statement to read from a young girl of 19 years of age. Something else happened to Michelle Smith. She came third in the 200 meters butterfly, okay? And what was interesting was that when she was asked by one of the Irish journalists, hey Michelle, how come you didn't win a 4th gold medal? What was her response? She said, my goggles broke just before the race and I had to borrow a pair from another swimmer. So instantly she's transforming her failure, in inverted commas, into, something else happened that put me off. And as she said herself about it at that time, she said, it wasn't really me in the first 100 meters. Normally I'm way up there and I'm out a little bit faster. It took me a little while to get into the race and I couldn't really catch up. So she wasn't blaming or turning it in on herself. And just to say, Alison Wagner today is fully recovered, doing very well, has her own business, and you can see her smiley, happy face here. But interesting, if you want to check out her history, just look up Alison Wagner, 2 L's, and check it out. Very, very interesting story, but just goes to show how attributional style plays a huge part in our success or failure. So that someone who was the 2nd best in the world, it just wasn't good enough. What was interesting in my own look at this was that, in fact, in 1996, Nike, the shoe manufacturers or clothing manufacturers, they brought out a tagline at that time, which was part of their advertising campaign, which was, second place is for losers. Yeah. What chance had she got? So, now, some of you are asking, I imagine, are there downsides to being optimistic? Yes, there are. Okay? People who are optimists tend to make assumptions that are too positive, and it can lead to disastrous miscalculations. We know too that they underestimate risks. So they're less likely to go to their doctor for a precautionary checkup because they assume it'll be fine. They're less likely to apply sunscreen. They're less likely to open a saving account. And also it results in bad planning. They always think that projects take less time to complete and that they cost less than they end up. Now, I have to say and confess, standing here today, my wife says this about me all the time. So when I say, I'm just going to change that plug, and she asks me, how long is it going to take? I say, nah, 10 minutes max. She says, right, I'm adding on another 10. So, because every project takes a little bit longer, but my style tends to be a little bit more, yeah, this won't take too long to get done. But we do tend to be a little bit careless from that perspective. And the other side of it as well, of course, is that gamblers we know are inveterate optimists. The problem is that they tend to focus not on their losses, but on their wins, but critically what they see as their foreseeable wins. Okay? So in other words, how much I'm going to win, and they get very stuck in that style. So that when they start winning, they don't quit at that point. They just think, you know, I could win more here. Remember the guy who broke Barings Bank, Nick Leeson, a number of years ago? Okay, you know, there was a certain point in time, this guy was gambling with billions. There was a certain point in time when he actually broke even. He got back all the money that he had gambled, and the bank was safe. But he kept going, and then he ended up breaking a bank. So I want you to think about the idea of positive and negative explanatory styles. And I want to ask, where do you see yourself in this model? Or when life events haven't worked out for you, who gets the blame? And do you see a pattern there? Practical measures when you're unemployed. Just to get down to some of the nitty-gritty stuff that you can do practically. A lot of people, when they become unemployed, keep it to themselves, very often because of shame or because of anxiety about it. It's actually not a good idea to keep it to yourself. Share it around, let other people know, build a social support network. Secondly, get out of bed every day. It's surprising how, maybe not in the first couple of weeks, but over time, people often find when they become unemployed, they stop doing the routine stuff, even like getting out of bed every day. I know one chap I was dealing with recently who was telling me, I was asking him, you know, how he was getting. He said, well, I didn't get up until 2 o'clock today. I'm thinking, come on, man, this doesn't help when you fall into that pattern. He never would have seen himself as being like that beforehand. So it really is important, even the simple things like this actually make a difference. Get out of bed every day and have a routine. Create a routine for yourself every day so that there are things that you're going to do, people you've got to see, phone calls you've got to make, places you've got to be. So keep on working on creating a routine, even if it's just to go down to the local library or whatever it might be. Be physically active. Don't worry about joining a gym or if you feel you've had to give up your gym membership. What you can always do is walk to the gym and just walk back again. You don't have to go in. Saves you an awful lot of money. And you can time yourself every day. Volunteer. You know, very often people find that volunteering helps. One of the reasons is, and I know you've had a recruiter talking to you already today, but we know that 50% of the jobs that are out there never get advertised. And people, you know, work themselves silly sometimes, constantly focusing on jobs that are advertised. And I'm not saying don't go after them, but what I am saying is recognize that 50% of the jobs out there actually are not advertised because of networking. So building up a social support network and sometimes just volunteering to be in a certain place at a certain time to do something, whether that's for a local charity or to turn up to help out with giving out dinners or whatever it might be, just builds up contacts, gets you to know people who know people. And we know that again, I know even in Trinity College and where they work with their graduates there and help them to get jobs. One of the big things they talk about nowadays is building your social network. People who know people can get you jobs as well. The other thing too is that this might be the ideal time to consider a new interest. That might send you down a path of a new career. It may not, but at least again, it will help. One of the reasons for this is that building new interests also helps to sharpen you creatively. And even if you want to think of a very simple exercise in creativity, I want you to think about the way that, I'm not going to ask anyone this, but I want you to think about the way in which you got dressed this morning. Okay? What went on first? What went on last? All right? Now, chances are you probably do the same thing in the same way every day if you're like most people. All right? Now, what we know is that even taking a simple task like that and doing it differently, find a way just to do it a little bit differently, actually generates a creative bubble in your mind. And even making a sandwich. What's the normal way of making a sandwich is you butter a couple of slices of bread and you put something in the middle. But there's another way of making a sandwich. You could put all the stuff on the plate and just put the bread on top of it and slide it off onto the other piece. Now, I know, a little bit crazy, but what I'm saying is that thinking creatively can start to get you to think creatively about things like this as well, about being unemployed or breaking the pattern that you might be in. And the more that you can do things like that, so think about things that you do routinely and ask yourself, could I do it differently? And as I said there earlier on as well, maintaining social contacts becomes vital. If you're invited to a party, go to the party. Where you might feel, oh, I can't go, I'm miserable, I haven't got anything new to wear or whatever, go and mix because you just don't know who you're going to meet. A few years ago, it's a completely different scenario, but a guy who was attending me who tended to be very down on himself, and I was challenging him around this about social contacts, and I said, look, you've got to get out there and push yourself into situations that you normally wouldn't do. So on the way home from attending me, he was on the bus, and he saw two, as it turned out later to be, two Italians, and they were going back into town as he was, and he could hear them trying to figure out how to get up to St. Stephen's Green, and he knew from what they were the way they were looking at the map, they hadn't a clue. So taking on board what I said to him, he decided, I'll just go over and maybe butt in and see what happens. So we offered to help them out, and he said, look, I'm actually going up that way, I'll take you along. And they said, oh, thank you very much, you're very good, and blah, blah, blah. And they got chatting to him while he was on the way, and they said, you've been so kind, you must meet our friends, we're meeting a gang of our friends. He says, well, okay, fine. And they said, come on, we're going to have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, will you join us? Okay, he ends up going out with one of the girls from the group, ends up going to Italy later that year, getting a job over there. And he said, just one act can change your life like that. So, do maintain your social contacts.